Our guest on this edition of Danny Frank is Eileen Rockefeller. Eileen Rockefeller Growald, to be precise. And Eileen is a resident of Shelbourne, Vermont, and she has recently written a book which has been receiving a lot of attention at places like Northshire Books, where you visited both the Manchester Center store and also in Saratoga. And being a Rockefeller, being myself. So before we tackle the book, Eileen, how did you wind up in Shelbourne, Vermont? Must be a story about how you made Shelbourne as your residence.
Absolutely, and it is being a Rockefeller, becoming myself. I can't claim to be myself in my fullest whole self yet. I think I'll be dying by the time I reach that. But I came to Shelbourne in 1978 looking for a weaving studio. At the time I was in my late 20s and I was weaving professionally, but I had just received my master's in early childhood education and had taught at Milton Academy in Massachusetts. And because I'd gone to Middlebury College, graduating in 1974, I fell in love with the state and was determined that I would return. So through various friends, I was told that there might be a space in the farm barn of Shelbourne Farms. Well, there just might have been. It's an enormous place. Have you ever seen the farm barn at Shelbourne Farms with this huge Germanic structure?
Yes.
And now all those spaces are filled to capacity, I'm happy to say, with their administrative offices and bakery and all kinds of things. Such a wonderful place to visit. But at that time, the Webbs had just decided to turn it into a nonprofit, and I ended up not only weaving, but then soon thereafter became a volunteer, and I helped start their education programs.
It really speaks to the state of Vermont and Shelbourne that as a Rockefeller, with all of the worldly locations at your disposal, that you would, again, wind up in the state of Vermont.
Well, there are several good reasons. One, I certainly have some family history. My Uncle Lawrence had a residence with his wife, Mary French Rockefeller, which is now the Marsh-Billings Rockefeller State National Park. And so we had visited him in Woodstock a number of times growing up, and I was very fond of my Uncle Lawrence. But also the values of my family passed down on really both sides, from my grandfather on my father's side and my mother, the values of nature and of connecting to nature as a means of recuperation, restoration, and reflection were very important values. So, and beauty is another, natural beauty is such an important thing to all of us in my family. That's why my grandfather ended up giving the money for about 7 national parks. And I don't know how much that's known, but Acadia National Park, Yellowstone, part of Yellowstone, the Tetons, part of the Yosemite, Great Smoky Mountains, that's 5 anyway.
Eileen Rockefeller, you mentioned you graduated from Middlebury College, and I know Rockefeller family members have had involvement in Middlebury over the years, and also Dartmouth, which of course is right over the Vermont border.
Well, I didn't have anything to do with Dartmouth, but my Uncle Nelson and I believe my Uncle John both went to Dartmouth. And my cousin Stephen came to be a professor at Middlebury, a professor of religion, I think the term after I first arrived, and he was there for some 30 years, ended up being dean of the faculty.
So Eileen Rockefeller, what motivated you to write this book at this point in your life?
It was motivated by 2 reasons. One, initially it was going to be a book about a special 5-month period with our sons where we spent the time on our farm living as if in the 1840s. We did an experiment in simple living, is what it was called. And I happened to love that period of time with our sons. I started writing all those stories. But then I realized they were too close in age to when it would go to publication, and it can be embarrassing for sons in their 20s to be out there with their mother's stories of them and the little boys. So I've shelved those for now, but really it then became a deeper form of personal exploration and a discovery of self. And you know, I think it doesn't matter what family we come from, we all have the task of becoming ourselves. So my stories, while they're about me and my life, approach universal issues that we all face.
Eileen Rockefeller, there was a time in American history when your great-grandfather and your grandfather, John D. Rockefeller and John D. Rockefeller Jr., right?
Yes.
And their oil empire was in fact larger than the United States government.
Well, that's still pretty shocking to me.
The phenomenon.
It is a phenomenon, and I was saying last night in a book talk that I think the genesis of my great-grandfather's interest in money partly came from natural skill in accounting and accruing and being a visionary, and it also partly came psychologically from ironically, a sense of scarcity in his childhood, because his father was variously known as a snake oil salesman and a horse thief and a polygamist. And he would disappear from home for sometimes months at a time. His son, being the eldest of the family, would be trying to help his mother pay for the bills, and they didn't know if they would have enough money. So this sense of deeply rooted responsibility and uncertainty, and he was raised in a Northern Baptist tradition. He believed God had intended for him to make this money and that it was going to be his responsibility to see that it was spent correctly.
And this was in Pennsylvania, I believe, right? Where your great-grandfather started out?
No, I think it was in near Moravia, New York, and I can't think of the other place right now. It is in my book in the first chapter. But no, it was in upstate western New York where he was born, Richfield, and interestingly enough, before he was at all rich.
One of the familial contacts which you deal with in your book, which is common in a number of families where they're driven by an ultra-successful patriarch or matriarch, the problems or inability of the children and the offspring and family members to perform at an equal level, and the psychology of being constantly eclipsed or overshadowed, overwhelmed, even though maybe it's unintended by the parent. And you describe some of this in one of your book's chapters when you graduated from Middlebury College.
Well, let me just say for a moment first that to continue on that theme of scarcity, I think it's a myth in this country that people with wealth have it all, that that's all we need to aspire to. And what I've just alluded to, of course, before my great-grandfather was wealthy, he grew up in a home that really did experience both scarcity of money and scarcity of his father, which made the deepest imprint on his life. My family fortunately had abundance of wealth and opportunity and comforts of life, but there was scarcity experienced among my siblings, and it was scarcity of attention, of the right kind of attention to who we really were and in embracing each of us as individuals. So I think it's a very important point that I make in my book through my stories, that it's not about, that life is not so much about material wealth as the connections we make. So the point of being overshadowed is one I've experienced throughout my life, it's once in a blue moon that somebody makes that much money. And then because he was so generous in the way he left it in trusts, in addition to all of the philanthropy that he had his son do, we haven't had to have traditional jobs until the fifth, sixth generations. But the values of service have been intrinsic, and they've been imprinted upon us by example as much as by word. When I graduated from Middlebury, naturally they're always looking for someone to be honored at that time, want to give honorary degrees, and it was probably a natural draw that they wanted my father to be given an honorary degree. I suffered from dyslexia early on in my childhood, and also mostly by fear of failure in the face of all this success. So graduating from Middlebury was a hard-won experience, one that I personally wanted to really celebrate and have the focus on, in my family, on me on that day. So I do write about how difficult it was to have my father invited to receive an honorary degree and how upsetting that was for my mother. But my mother got into Bennington, and by full scholarship, because her mother, although she'd gained huge sums from developing a dress design business that she sold in 1901. They lost it all in the crash. Her parents were feeling very ashamed at not having the money, so they wouldn't let her go to Bennington. Their values were that it's more important to show that you have money than to have a good education. So she was reacting to the fact that she never got to go to college.
It has always impressed me among many Rockefeller extended family members, the mission of public service and philanthropy,
yes,
which is very extensive. Can you speak to that?
During my maturing years of the 20s and 30s, we still had a family philanthropy committee, and it was the training ground for incoming family members to learn about philanthropy and service. And I would say that service is just as important in the hierarchy of what's a good thing to do as philanthropy. And of course, as we have less money to give, it's a good thing that they have valued service. But collaborations became the evolution to the inability of one person to give quite as much as they might want. Well, we could form philanthropic collaboratives. And if 3 people came together, gave a certain amount of money, we could start it off. That then led to, in the turn of the century, I was asked to chair the Family Philanthropy Committee and to do a study of whether it still made financial sense to have that committee in our family office. Well, long story short, it didn't. The committee I worked with decided to spin it out into its own philanthropic service, which became the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. So I was the founding chair of that, and I think you were going to ask about that
yes,
as well.
Sure.
Well, so so the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors is an organization that helps both startup philanthropists and people who've been in it a long time to develop their roadmap and to give strategically to subjects of their interest. And it's now the largest philanthropic advisory service in the world. So I'm proud to have helped establish that. For geographic and other reasons, I don't actually use them personally. My husband and I founded our own philanthropy several years ago in 2007.
The Growald Family Fund.
The Growald Family Fund. And with very little money comparatively, we decided that we had to be extremely strategic, and it worked best to work with one person who was local at the time, and we decided to focus all of our giving on stemming climate change, and specifically in reducing CO2 in the atmosphere.
Giving money, being philanthropic, there's enormous pressure and enormous responsibility with it. And obviously you have some tenets or policies or standards on which you reach that decision to make a grant. Can you give our viewers a little perspective on that?
Well, my father always used to say, and his father before him, it's easy to give money away, it's not easy to give it well. And that is so true. It takes a great deal of thought and attention and prioritizing to know what you can really make a difference in. And I think that the best way to come to such a decision is to first uncover your values and lay them out. And we've even done this. I led a process with all my cousins in my Rockefeller family as to what were their philanthropic values. And among them is family unity, interestingly, and protecting the environment and keeping a sense of humor, not taking ourselves too seriously. Those are the extended family, some of their values. With my husband and I, we felt it was important that we create a fund that our sons could join us in at some point, and they're actively involved now.
Now, I know when we speak about public service, too, a number of your family members have been in public service. Nelson Rockefeller, who was your uncle,
Yes.
governor of New York and later vice president. I had the pleasure, the privilege of meeting him, I'm going to say about 25
That's
times
so great,
over
and there you
his
are.
career. Yeah, Danny Frank from many years ago. And your cousin, I guess, Jay, is presently a U.S. Senator.
Yes, he
right?
has been for many years, West Virginia.
And another uncle, Winthrop, was governor of Arkansas.
Correct.
So,
yeah.
Any more Rockefellers on the horizon, you think, for
We're not
public
sure.
office or public service?
You know, it's too soon to tell, Danny, but I think there may be one or two who might go in that direction, but as I think is wise, they're getting their feet wet in either business or policy analysis or things like that first.
And I must say that people don't appreciate and remember with Nelson Rockefeller, when he was appointed and chosen as vice president, the very critical time that he came in, and certainly a job that he did not need. But
one that he really wanted.
Yeah, but the importance of him stepping into that role at that particular time, you know, and what it meant for the United States of America. Eileen Rockefeller, in terms of growing up, when was the point in time of self-discovery that you, Eileen Rockefeller, were different in terms of the way you were raised and your upbringing from most Americans?
I think my first memory would have to be 4th grade. I was 9 years old, and we were chauffeured to school by a very nice man from Norway, and we were taken, you know, in a private car, and we knew this was different. Other people were brought by their parents, or they went on the bus, and my siblings and my response to this was to get out of the car 2 blocks before school and walk to school so that we looked like everyone else. My mother always said to us, as a Rockefeller, you'll either get double praise or double blame, and it's best to blend in where you can.
Many people who read or know about the Rockefellers, or people today, say, like Warren Buffett, think that if I was only blessed with their wealth and money, what I would be able to do. And as your book points out, and we touched on this a little bit a few moments ago, there really is a whole other side, a whole other range of consequences to consider. And
Yes.
please share a little of that with us.
Well, as I may have said earlier, I think that real richness and wealth comes not from the material world, but from our connections to ourselves and others. And if we don't have a sense of who we are, it doesn't matter how much money we have. It's never going to fill the hole of the unknowing of ourselves. And so,
and wealth doesn't necessarily shield people or families from tragedy and disappointment. I mean, even looking to, again, my connection to your Uncle Nelson, I remember his son, Michael, I think it was, over in, who
yes.
was killed in the South Pacific. And,
yes, in New Guinea. And actually, to hear that story, you really ought to interview my cousin Mary Rockefeller Morgan, who's written a wonderful book called When Grief Calls Forth the Healing. She was the twin of Michael, and she's written a really beautiful book of stories about that period and how it took her 35 years before she was able to cry because it was not considered appropriate at the time of his loss. I've experienced a personal loss equal to hers in the last month when my brother Richard, my next of kin, went down in a plane crash the day after my father's 99th birthday. There's an example of he had the money to have a small plane. He'd flown for 40 years. It was an utter tragedy. Money can't cure something like that.
Eileen Rockefeller, your father, David, the surviving Rockefeller of his generation, have you talked with him recently about how he thinks America and the world has evolved during his lifetime?
Well, at 99 years old, he's a very present person, but he is also able to recall history very beautifully. And I think that I would have to say he's disappointed at how fractionalized we've become, how disparate the parties are, how people don't fraternize anymore outside of Congress, outside of the meetings in the Senate. In his day, a Rockefeller Republican was one who was interested in different points of view, who knew how to listen, and who knew how to speak from a place of respect. And I don't think that's happening to the extent that it used to. And I'm very worried about the future of our country, and I think that he is too. What he values most is family. And sadly, we're seeing the disappearance of family in our country. One of the things that I always say to people that I think is the most important about the way I was raised and the way I've raised our children is simply to have dinner together, listen to your children. And in fact, the National Merit Scholarship Society has done a test some years back on what they evaluated 100 variables of what would make a good National Merit Scholar. And the only common denominator was whether that student had had dinner together with their family.
Amazing.
Isn't it?
Eileen Rockefeller, your father, David, what would he like to see as the family's legacy in the future? Have you discussed that with him?
Oh, yes. And I think his first response would be he wants the family to stay together. He has been the most wonderful gatherer of family, and since the time I was very small, we used to tease him, but now we agree with him. When we all came together, he would raise his glass and stand up and say, "Isn't it wonderful to have the whole family together?" And you know, he still feels that way today, but in terms of the legacy in the world, I think he feels that from a solid place of family, one can go out and be in the world, do really good service, live to your fullest potential, and know that at the end of a day of hard work, you can come home to love and safety.
So how many Rockefeller family members are we talking about? And do you have any occasional get-togethers
Oh,
with
yes.
the whole?
Oh, yes. We have 150 blood relatives, about 250 with spouses. And we gather twice a year for family meetings for an entire weekend. And this is part of how we stay together. And we have these wonderful intergenerational dialogues where we go around the room and each person has 2 minutes to share whatever comes to them.
So is there an agenda at these
No,
meetings?
not that part of the meeting. There is
yeah.
an agenda for the more formal meeting. There's a business meeting, and then there are a variety of ways that we gather to get to know each other and continue our bonds.
Eileen Rockefeller, as we close our show, your organic farm in Shelbourne, tell me about the future of organics, say, between now and the end of this decade, and then what you predict for the long term.
Well, first of all, I think that if we don't go forward with more organics and local agriculture, we're only going to be causing more CO2 in the atmosphere for transportation. It makes so much sense. And there's a sense of local pride when you buy cheese from your state. Vermont has some of the best artisanal cheeses
It really does,
anywhere.
right?
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. And wonderful local food, and there are organizations teaching farmers to be local farmers. I really, and my oldest 3 siblings are working very hard on creating a local farm-to-table vegetable farm in upstate New York. And it will be linked partly to stone barns, which my sister Peggy and my father started in my mother's memory. I have a long history of interest in farming, and I believe that farming organically is going to be the way of the future, because we're killing our bees, we're killing all kinds of creatures, and there's even evidence that some people are saying that the escalation of autism may be because of chemicals that are in the soils and the water. So we have to take a look at it, and I think we're going to be forced to.
What is some major breakthrough or discovery that you think may come about in organic farming, say 15 or 20 years from now? Is there one particular huge advance that will someday happen in organic farming?
Well, you know, this is not my area of expertise. I'm working on climate, but it is related, of course. If we take more of the chemicals off of the fields, we may see, we hope, the return of bees. This is one of, they're such tiny insects. I love the name of gnat television. Bees are almost as small as gnats, and yet if we continue to use pesticides and herbicides, we won't be able to have our fruits and vegetables pollinated. A third of the food on our table is pollinated, and my husband has started the National Organization to Protect Pollinators. So I really think that the future of farming depends on very wise choices and disciplined choices that have not as much to do with the greatest amount of money, but the greatest longevity of health.
Our guest has been Eileen Rockefeller Growald, and you will enjoy reading her new book, Being a Rockefeller, Becoming Myself, which is published by Blue Rider Press. And I know it's on sale at Northshire Books, both in Manchester and Saratoga, and probably many other bookstores
Amazon,
around the nation.
if you have
right?
to.
And thank you for this wonderful half hour.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it so much. And I also have a website at eileenrockefeller.com where I have a weekly blog. So you can also order my book there.
Great interview.
Thank you so much, Danny. Okay.
This is Danny Frank for GNAT TV.